Lüdemann.
Dr. Craig's first point was that we agree that most likely Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus. We do agree, in fact, but I think that Dr. Craig makes too much out of it. I'm glad that he admitted that this has nothing to do with the Jewish council determining the guilt of Jesus. So I'm very glad that he admits that. But secondly, he says, well, since Joseph, a council member, buried him, the place of Jesus' burial place was known in Jerusalem, and therefore people could have asked Joseph of Arimathea where he was buried in order to refute the Christian claim that he rose from the dead. That's the argument. Here I have to come to a major point, to a major question, namely, what do we know about Christianity in Jerusalem during the first weeks? And secondly, when did the Christian preaching start? Let me begin with the second question. According to the Acts of the Apostles, it was not until 40 days after Jesus' death that the preaching started. Given the climate in Jerusalem, where the decaying of corpses happened very quickly, I doubt whether after 40 days it was possible to determine the identity of that person. That's number one. Second, we don't know whether it started 40 days after the death of Jesus, because the report in Acts is legendary. And here I would have to go into the details of the criticism of Acts. Dr. Craig and I have a different opinion about the trustworthiness of the data in Acts. Let me explain that, or give you an explanation which relates to our discussion. According to the book of Acts, Paul was not an apostle. Paul was not an apostle, while according to his letters, whom I trust more, he was an apostle. So already on that point, the author of Acts was either ignorant or didn't tell the truth. If you look at the conversion story in Paul in Acts in chapter 9, you see it's in a series of 3 conversion stories. The conversion of the Enoch from Ethiopia, then Paul, and then the conversion of the first Roman centurion. So he thinks of Paul's turning to Christianity as a conversion and not as a calling to be an apostle. If that's the case, that the author of Acts was so ignorant about the history of the early days, we can't trust him, and we really don't know when actually the public preaching of Christianity started in Jerusalem. It may have lasted months, and if that's the case, there would be no chance of identifying Jesus' corpse as a rebuttal against the Christian claim. Another point, the visit of the women to the tomb. I don't think that we can say that the women visited the tomb. I would bracket that in and would postpone it, because there are other things we can discuss here, but if you have questions, I will come back to that. Let me now turn to major issues. How, Dr. Craig asked, was it possible, if we talk about visions or hallucination or guilt or work, that they saw a risen one, and not somebody who was in the paradise? Here I have to talk a little bit about resurrection. What does resurrection mean in the Christian context? Again, I base that on the letters of Paul. 2 passages, one is in Romans 1, 3-4, where it's being said, Jesus was made God since or through the resurrection of the death. And a second, in 1 Corinthians 15:20, Jesus is called the first fruit of the risen Christ is called the first fruit of those who are dead. So in other words, resurrection here means that the hope of the coming age that the Jews had was fulfilled. The general resurrection would take place, and Jesus was the first to represent that new age through his resurrection. That's the context of the talk about Jesus' resurrection. And that's also must have been the context that Jesus talked to his disciples about the future. My claim is Jesus must have talked in some ways about the resurrection of the dead to his disciples so that the disciples were able to connect when he was dead. That was the hope that his fate and his being seen has to do with the resurrection, the general resurrection, which is going to happen in the very near future. To give you another example of that, what I'm talking about, we have a passage in Matthew where we see Jesus died, and when he died, the moment of his death, the saints, the tombs were opening, the saints were walking around in Jerusalem, and Matthew is correcting that happened after 3 days, because he has still had the opinion that the resurrection of Jesus happened on the third day. But originally in that text that Matthew is quoting, the idea was that Jesus, when he died, was immediately exalted to heaven, and that then led to the fulfillment of the hope of a general resurrection, that all the Christians, all the saints would be coming out of their tombs. And here we already see that it was not universally held in Christianity that resurrection happened on the third day. As I said already earlier, exaltation means exaltation, the moment of death. And here in Matthew 27 we see the general resurrection is happening at the moment of death of Jesus. And here we see already that exaltation and resurrection are closely related and almost identical. So that's the context of resurrection that we talk about here. And I would ask you and Dr. Craig, when he says resurrection on the third day and visit of the woman to the tomb on the third day, what should we make out of that? Was Jesus actually raised on the third day? Only on the third day, and then the woman could come and find his body empty. So how should we account here? Raised on the morning of the third day and the woman coming afterwards? And I would add the question, should we now really explain that by assuming a miracle? Remember, if Jesus was there 2 days and such a climb, was dead, his body was already decomposing, he was cold, all interruption, his brain was dead. Should we really think that such a thing can happen? Are there future doctors among you? Should we really assume as modern men or men and women that something like that could be possible? Still, you could say a miracle, but it would be a very rare, or I would say almost unlikely thing that should have happened. Whenever I talk to doctors about that, they inform me that can never happen. But Dr. Craig, obviously, because he's tracing that back to God, thinks it can happen. Okay? But I think we have to look for another hypothesis to exclude such a very, very unlikely event, and I would hereby officially retract as far as what I'm said about Kant and Hume. I said that in footnotes. I'm a working historian, I'm not a philosopher as Dr. Craig is. Let's not talk about Kant and Hume. Don't know enough about that. I'm working with the text and trying to offer the most plausible hypothesis. And now we have a job to do. How can we explain that Peter, who had denied Jesus, all of a sudden claimed to have seen Jesus? And secondly, how can we explain that somebody who persecuted the church and Jesus all of a sudden turned to that new faith? Dr. Craig says, well, that's a miracle. I'm saying it's too simple. We have another way of trying to solve that. In the case of Paul, we are much better off than in the case of Peter, and I would like to postpone the question of Peter. We don't have any primary sources about Peter. But we do have about Paul.